Welcome back to Aeropro Coaching. This is Roy, and wanted to welcome everyone back to podcast number 3, I believe. So we're at 3 here of clipping in, and I'm going to interrupt the story. We were kind of developing the story, how I went from corporate America to how I got into endurance coaching and so forth. But I want to interrupt that with what I thought it was a cool podcast on IRONMAN. So this past weekend. Or a couple weekends ago, I had a few athletes finish Ironman Chattanooga, and early on in my coaching career, probably about 7 years ago, well, let me back further than that. Like, I started out in triathlon. That was where I got introduced to endurance sports, and I started out doing triathlons and did a bunch of them. Got a little burnt out on it, and so then I ended up deciding to go on to road racing. But nonetheless, I started coaching some endurance athletes. And so I ended up coaching a lady named Debbie, and she did Ironman Cozumel. So that was our first one. I convinced her somehow that it would be a good idea to let me coach her for her first Ironman. And it was my first coaching experience. And I remember she did really well in it for her first experience. So fast forward 7 years later, now I've coached about 70 athletes to doing Ironman, and I wanted to share the athletes that I just finished working with. So there were 3 of them that I was working with, and I just did a bike fit today on an Ironman athlete, and it's really why I wanted to do this podcast. I wanted to just kind of talk about Ironman, some of the things I learned today that I thought may be helpful for Ironman athletes. And I want to start off with the email that I got from the athlete who did Chattanooga. His name's Craig. And a little backstory on Craig. He hired me last year. Actually, his wife did. His wife called me. She wanted to buy him a Christmas present, and she bought him coaching for Ironman. I'm not sure. That's probably the equivalent of buying my wife a vacuum cleaner for Christmas. So, but anyway, she said, "Hey, I want to buy him Ironman coaching," and I said, okay, that sounds great. And then so I started working with Craig last year. He was signed up to do, I believe, his Ironman Maryland, and he got there, but probably about 3 or 4 weeks before, he ended up injuring himself. I think getting ready for the hurricanes here in Florida, or a hurricane. So he got injured, and he wasn't able to start. He went there, he went to the event, but he had to pull out of it because of an injury. So this year we started back on it again, and he struggled a little bit. He's like everybody. He has work, he's a professional, he has kids, and so he kept struggling back and forth as far as fitting in the time. I know we've had a few conversations like, hey, you got to get this done or else you're not going to be able to complete this Ironman. So anyway, he finished Ironman, and I got this email from him, and I thought this was a pretty cool email, and I'm just going to summarize it a little bit. He said, "Hey, it was a great experience, except that he had lots of pain and blisters on his feet that he had to suffer through during this Ironman." And so he talks about the first lap of the bike. It was a 2-loop bike loop course, and it was pretty hilly, and he felt really strong in the first loop. Probably went out a little bit hard. So a lot of times our first Ironman or our first event, we tend to go out a little bit hard because we get over anxious, and so he did that. And then the second, he suffered a little bit. And then he ended up pulling himself together in the run, and then finishing the run and finishing the Ironman. And he said 2 things got him through this. So 2 key moments got him through this. And one, said that when his kids, the notion of his kids waiting at the start-finish line for him, so he said, I better fucking finish. So that's key. Obviously, if you have your family there, you have significant others, loved ones, and you told them that you were going to do this event, they showed up to the event, and they're waiting at the start-finish, and you don't finish, then that's pretty bad. So a good motivator is, hey, I better finish so my loved ones see me cross the line, and they yell out, hey, Craig, you're an Ironman. And then the second one is a comment that I made in an email to him. And basically, we spent 2 years trying to get you through this, so let's finish this shit. And I remember that email I sent to him. And so those are the 2 thoughts that went through his mind. And to me, that's key because during Ironman training, it's so long the event's so long, you got to hold on to a couple things. And maybe that one of those things is something someone said to you along the way. Maybe it's a motivation from your kids or your wife or girlfriend or whatever. And so, as a coach, it's impactful to me to see this email because something I said was part of these two things. So I think as coaches, we need to be cognizant of what we're saying to our athletes, how we're motivating them, and giving them little things to hold on to. And I think that that was pretty cool that we pulled out of this. And then, so he says here, he got to the hotel, barely could walk, blisters all over his feet. But when he saw his 9-year-old daughter smiling and how proud she was, then all the pain went away and all the training was worth it. So right there makes me want to sign up to do an Ironman, to be honest with you. So he finishes, he's in pain. He's like, I'm never going to do this again. I remember I got a text from him. I think shortly after it said, done and fucking done. But then he gets back to the room. His 9-year-old is there, smiling, proud as can be, and all the pain goes away and it's worth it. And then he says his son, who had fallen asleep because he finished late, he said the next morning when his son woke up, his son saw the medal and was yelling, "Daddy, you won," and was ecstatic. And so he says there's no better feeling than that. And so those things, if you don't do it, if you're not in the moment, if you don't have that, you'll never have that experience. Like, you'll never have the experience of your son or daughter or family member or anyone feeling that proud. And like, kids are great, right? Kids are genuine. So if you have a booger hanging out, your kids can be like, "Hey, Dad, you got a booger hanging out." So like, when the kid is legitimately feeling that excitement, that joy, that happiness, that proud feeling, that's a genuine feeling. And so, that alone, again, I just wanted to share that because I thought that was, for me, it was really cool to read this and to see that that joy, that happiness that this athlete had achieved in this. So I had two other athletes do this, but I want to segue a little bit from that and talk about I want to talk about a person I was working on today. They're a high-end athlete, really good triathlete, either wins or qualifies for world championships and does these different events. She mentioned something to me that I thought it was cool. So she's had a couple coaches. She had a coach originally that did a lot of high volume, I think she mentioned 300 miles a week, 50 miles of running, 11 miles of swimming. And she liked it. She enjoyed it more or less. Maybe she tolerated it more than enjoyed it, but kept doing it, and got hurt. Ended up getting hurt, getting injured, getting away from the sport. And then she sought off, she looked for another coach, found another coach. And this coach has a different approach as well. And this coach is lower volume. So now she's doing, a lot less miles on the bike, a lot less miles on the run. And she is in the midst of that. So we're not sure how that's going to turn out for her. I'm not going to use her name or anything like that. I didn't get permission, but I want to tell her story because I talked to her today. And so that's interesting. A point that she brought up is like, I don't want to say there are bad coaches, just like there's bad doctors, bad lawyers, bad, presidents, bad judges, whatever. And I'm not going to get on either side of the politics of that, but there are bad and good, or maybe there are different flavors, right? There, like, some people like, one person, some people do not like the other. I think we see that, we see that in the environment today and social media and everything. You got a subset of people who love this person and the other people hate them and so forth. So coaching's the same, right? I think that there's people out there that they love one coach and the other person hates that coach, and it's the same person, right? And there are bad coaches, right? There are people out there who just don't know what they're doing. They thought this was a great thing to get into, a hobby, or they feel that they want to invent something new and out there, and so there are those bad coaches out there. But I here, as this athlete was talking to me today, I was doing a bike fitting on them, they were talking about a high mileage approach, and they were talking about a low mileage approach, and then this, that, and the other thing. And I was like, yeah, you know what? Both approaches do work. And for certain athletes, that high mileage approach may work. Like, for example, if I'm a 25-year-old, 30-year-old athlete, I'm in like a really good shape, I can recover well, I don't have a lot of stresses on my life at that point, that high mileage is going to work and I'm going to get really good. But if I'm a 60-year-old athlete or a 50-year-old athlete and I have family and I got to work, maybe that high mileage approach isn't going to work for me, right? So maybe the approach needs to be adjusted based on that, on the actual workload or environment. Because a lot of times people are like, well, this pro did this, this pro rides 30 hours a week, and this pro does, I hear it all the time, Chris Froome spins 110 RPM up a mountain. Who the fuck cares? You're not Chris Froome and you don't train like Chris Froome, right? So like, most of the people listening to this are probably have a job, have kids, have a wife, a significant other, maybe only have 5 to 10 hours, 15 hours. Even if you have 20 hours to train, do you have 20 hours to train every week? Do you have a massage therapist? Do you have somebody grabbing your bike, working on it? Do you have somebody preparing your meals? And no, you don't. The answer is no, unless you're a professional listening to this, and then obviously you understand. But so I think that the programs need to be tailored or adjusted to that athlete. So here we have an athlete, they tried both, and what are they looking for? What are they looking for? They're looking for the perfect race, right? So this athlete's like, I want the perfect race where I can put it all together and achieve perfection. And I think, that's great. That's good. She has that objective, that goal of achieving that. But I think that also we need to keep it in perspective that perfection is probably never going to be achieved. Because and let me tell you why I say this. Because as soon as that person runs fast enough or bikes fast enough, they want to go faster. Like, I'll coach someone to do an A-level race, and let's call it a time trial. So they're going as fast as they can on a time trial bike, and maybe they do 15K, and they say, I want to go 30 miles an hour. Well, they go 30 miles an hour, but you know what they say afterwards? I could have gone a little faster. Every single time. And I know coaches out there, excuse me, if you're listening to this, you know what I'm talking about, because they're out there. After they're finished, they tell you right away, I could have gone faster. And everybody can go faster. Everyone, and so that perfect race is probably never achievable in perfection, but a solid race. So I think changing that to like, hey, I'm chasing a more solid race, a more balanced race, is key. So it was interesting to hear her talk about that, and to talk about her quest. And what's interesting for her also with her is that, so she has a nutrition coach, she has an endurance athlete coach, and now she hired me to be her bike fit coach. And so she's really going after this. And I think, again, in Ironman, it takes a lot of people. It takes a lot. It takes a lot of little coaches to help make that dream come true. And one thing I expressed to her, and I think that's really important, is that what I told to her is that she's been doing this for 4 years. So what I told her is that, she's chasing it, looking for perfection, has all these coaches, looking for all these different things. And what I said to her is that I think it takes 3 years to have a really good endurance coach, athlete, to be a really good endurance athlete. And this is what I meant by that. The first year, I think when we get into Ironman training or we get into triathlon training, we're just trying to figure it all out, right? We're trying to figure out, what gear do I need, how to bike, how to swim, how to run, how much time do I have to train, how do I fit it all in, what should I take goos, should I do liquid nutrition, should I do solid nutrition? We're all over the place, and we're reading everything we can. We're on the internet. We're trying to figure out what races to sign up for. We start joining little groups and all of this. And that first year is really like a big learning curve. There's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of buying going on, a lot of mistakes going on and changes and all that stuff. So that's what's going on in the first year. Once you get through all of that, I think the second year is when you start to kind of make some groundwork. You start to lay down a little bit of improvement on that first year after you get all of the confusion out of the way. And then the second year, you start to really lay down the foundation of training. You start to improve in certain areas. You got 3 sports, so it's hard to improve in all. So maybe you pick 1 or 1.5 to try to improve on. And then by the third year, you're a veteran. You've done a bunch of triathlons. You've probably worked your way up to a half Ironman and maybe even a full by this period of time. And now you're kind of like, hey, I know the gear that works for me. I know how to do the transitions. I know that, I kind of have a feeling of the style of workouts that work for me. And then you start to test the waters with a different coaching. Maybe you do long, higher mileage versus shorter mileage versus intensity versus non-intensity versus doing CrossFit versus doing keto diet versus. So now you're starting to kind of test the edges of that. And then by the 4th year, I think that's where you start to become a little competitive, depending on your level. Or you decided, hey, I'm not worried about being competitive, but I want to make this something that's part of my lifestyle. So there are 2 different athletes in endurance sports. One is like, hey, I want to be competitive. I want to qualify for worlds. I want to get on the podium. And the other one is I want this to be a lifestyle, something I do on a normal basis, maybe 1 a year as far as Ironman's concerned. I want to travel. I want to do different events. Or some people are just like, hey, I want to be fast. I want to win things. I want to do that. So typically around year 3, 4, you kind of figured out where you're at in the Ironman triathlon realm. So, and then so this athlete mentions to me high miles, low miles, and for example, her extremes were she had a coach they were doing 300 miles of the bike. I believe she said 50 miles of running and 11 miles of swimming. Now she's doing maybe 7 miles of running, or probably sounds like about 20 miles of running, maybe a couple hundred miles on the bike, and 2 to 3 swims a week. Still a hefty dose. And I think that what I came away with that is high mileage, low mileage, or the right mileage. And that's, I think, where the good coaching comes from. Now, are you going to know that in year 1? Are you going to know that in year 2? Probably not. It takes a little bit to learn. Like I have athletes myself. I have a guy, and I'll mention his name. His name's Russ. He lives out in Colorado. I can give him 14 days of work, a lot of miles. He can do 20, 30 hours a week, and he absorbs it very well, and we see improvement. I have another athlete who, if I give them anything more than 5 hours, they crumble. So, right, they're 2 different athletes. Now, Russ is about 26, 27. The other athlete's 70. So, there you go. Right there, here's an older athlete versus a younger athlete. Should I, if I have a generic plan where I give everybody, 30 hours of work or 300 miles, they're going to crumble. So that's where you, as you start to coach more, as you start to gain more experience, you have a bigger toolbox. So now my toolbox includes, a high mileage plan for those type of athletes and maybe a lower mileage plan. Both of them still getting a lot of results. So, and so she's kind of going back and forth, struggling a little bit. And I think that, you got to give coaches a chance. You got to give them the opportunity to fuck up and for you to fire them. And you got to give them the opportunity to get it right. Like converse with that coach. I remember early on when I was coaching Debbie, she would come back and say, hey, this is, X, Y, Z. I want to change this, this, this. I was like, no, it's basically my way or the highway. And that's because I was a new coach. Now as a tenured coach, I'll work with her now and she'll say, hey, I need you to adjust this. This is how I'm feeling. And then I have other tools in that toolbox. If I only have one tool, I got to make that tool fit for every job. But now I got 20 tools, so I have different ways to attack the same job, right? So I think that's with coaching and in tenure of coaching you come with. So again, so this athlete here is trying to find that balance, and I think that balance lies in a lot of different factors. So like what? One is age. The other is recovery. Some athletes just recover better than others. does one athlete have kids and a job and the other one doesn't, can sleep? And then tracking training stress. So I'm able to track, and coaches should be able to track the volume using power meters and run computers and all that. We can track the volume and the intensity of that volume. So it's not about how many miles, it's also about how hard those miles are or how fast those miles are. So now we're tracking intensity, we're tracking time. And by using those two tracking mechanisms, we can see when they break down. Example, I just had an athlete I did a consult with the other day. His name is John. He's a really good cyclist, and he got really sick. And we kind of narrowed in when he got to a certain training, and he does a lot of time. He spends probably about 25 hours on the bike, tolerates big training stress weeks. But when we did I think it was 2.5 hard weeks in a row, because he loves it, he broke down and got sick. Now, did he get sick directly from the training stress? Maybe not, but it did compromise his immune system. He was more susceptible to being sick, and then he got sick. So what we want to do is look at that and say, hey, when you get into the red zone, we need to back it down. And so same thing with endurance athlete, for Ironman athletes, like in training them, like sure, maybe 300 miles a week, 50 miles on the running and 11 works, but maybe 150 miles, 25 miles, and 5 miles of swimming works. And so by tracking the data, by tracking the training stress scores and seeing what works, I think is a better approach overall. And then customizing that for the athlete, each one is going to be different. And especially for Ironman, you have some athletes who can run more than others. You have some athletes who need to have more on the bike. You need to have some athletes who, let's go back to Craig, for example, with the Ironman. Craig had to do more cycling versus running because he just couldn't do too much volume. So we ended up doing more cycling. That fitness kind of crossed over to the running, but he did suffer on the run. You know, the only way to get really good at that running is to put the running in, but the cycling did help a little bit. So, but again, it wasn't like I didn't have one tool. Here it is, 300 miles. It was adjusting and crafting that for the athlete. And so, you know, we talked about the high mileage approach, low mileage approach, achieving the perfect race. You know, she has a team of people working for her to, you know, and she's has a lot of people involved for this person. And what's interesting is they're an amateur. They're never going to make a dime, but they're chasing this dream, this goal, like it's their job. And that's, for me as a coach, it's inspirational because, you know, a lot of times we'll write programs and we'll do these things and we're not sure if the athletes are even doing them or care or whatever. And so when you get in there, I know a lot of coaches, if they're listening on this, they get motivated. We get motivated when we see our athletes doing those workouts. When I see athletes putting notes in there and doing the workouts, that motivates me to go to that extra step. When you're skipping and you're taking a laissez-faire attitude about the whole approach to it, then we're going to do the same, right? We're going to kind of do that too. And that's just human nature. We try not to. And we may still give you exactly what you paid for. You know, we're giving you the workouts, we're monitoring it, we're giving you but we may not make that extra, you know, step if you're not making that extra step. And that's pretty common. All right. So this lady, she's obviously taking those extra steps. I mean, she came in today. She didn't really have any issues with her bike fit, but she wanted to get better. And so we spent some time doing that today. All right. So we have two other athletes who did the Ironman this weekend as well. So we had two other athletes. One athlete has done 6. So she has started about 3 years ago and has steadily built up and progressed, and now she's done 6 Ironman. And there was a point where I think she did 2, maybe 3 in a year and got burned out, took a year off and came back to it. And I think that the reason why this is important is that too much of a good thing. Okay, so she did too much of a good thing. She ended up burning out, and she ended up having to take some time off and go away from the sport. But she loves the sport. She loves the feeling of finishing an Ironman. And I think that, you know, doing more than one a year could be at your detriment. And it's not because of the event. It's because of the training, the time away from your families, the time away from others, and the non-social aspect sometimes of triathlon training. So I think that doing one a year is probably plenty, and you can fill that in with some other events. And and she just, I think after stepping back, taking a year off, getting back into it, I think the approach that she's going to take is of one where she's going to, make it a lifestyle. Make it a lifestyle. Now, there are people who are racing this and they know that their time is limited. That they're only going to do this for a short period of time and then they're going to be done in and out of the sport, right? And then there's people who are going to be doing this for a lifetime. I have a guy now that he's been doing it for over 30 years. So he wants to make it fun. He's not going to sit there and analyze every little thing. He's not going to count his macronutrients. He's not going to do that because he doesn't care as long as he finishes within, a reasonable time, 15, 16, 17 hours, in that lower end of the time frame. He's not looking to do 9-10 hours. All right. So now, does she want to get better? Does she want to get faster? Yeah, she does. But that's got to be a longer term approach, right? If you're not willing to do the 20, 30 hour weeks, you're not willing to live like a pro and sleep and recover and use all these different modalities out there to recover, you're going to have to take your time and be patient on that approach. So time and patience on the approach, consistency will get you where you want to be. Okay. And then again, making sure the program, that coaching program, fits your style and communicate with that coach. I think I wanted to bring up a topic, a point is that you should be able to communicate with your coach. You should be able to tell them, hey, this is working, this isn't working. How do you feel about this type of training? I think I'm not getting enough bricks, or I think I'm not getting enough strength training, whatever. And should be able to have that open communication. Doesn't mean you're questioning them. Okay, you still need to implement their program because every coach has a program. They have that experience. They've done a lot of trial and error. They've crafted what they are putting out to athletes, and you have to trust in that. If you don't trust in it, you shouldn't hire them. And I'll give you an example. I had an athlete hire me at the beginning of the year. The first week he was having issues with me. The second week, and by the end of the month, we were done. And he didn't trust me, and that's fine. I'm not worried about that. The trust factor, I want the athletes to trust what we're doing. If they're not entrusting what I'm doing, then they shouldn't pay me and they shouldn't hire me. And that's with any coach. You have to be willing to be all in. Now, it doesn't mean go blindly, right? Don't go blindly, but be all in, trust the system, and then let the system play out. Now, at the end of the year, if the system plays out and you look back on the key performance indicators and you didn't meet your objectives, or you didn't meet a majority of those objectives, then there's an issue, right? Like if we sit back and we say, hey, we were trying to achieve, 5 key performance indicators, 5 key points, and we got 4 of them or 3 of them, that's successful, right? That's a majority. But if we look back and we only got 1, that may not be successful. It might not be a successful relationship, or you may want to take that relationship in a different direction for the next year. Or you just want to fire them. So you have to buy into the program. And in shopping programs, just shopping, looking for that 1 year, fix. Sometimes it's multiple years. Sometimes it takes time. Sometimes it takes time for the athlete and the coach to learn each other. That relationship and that bond is important. And the last person I want to talk about and then end this podcast, and I'm sorry I rambled a little bit. I just go off just some basic notes. So I don't really precast this. I don't really have maybe in the future I will precast it. Maybe that'll come off better. I don't know. But again, I was doing a fitting today and I said, hey, I want to do this podcast and I want to interrupt kind of the sequentialness of what we were doing before and jump in here and talk about Ironman training. And then the last guy's name is Jake. Jake started last year and he wanted to do an Ironman. He signed up for a couple events. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to do that with work-life balance and some injuries. And this is where I was getting Jake's program wrong. I was giving him too much intensity. He was doing lots of intensity. He ended up pulling muscles, getting injured. And it wasn't crazy intensity, but it was just enough, right? It was enough to push him along and cause injury. On top of that was stress and life and all that. It came crashing down. He didn't race really at all last year, and he wasted a lot of money on some events that he signed up for. And this year, we took a new approach, and I said, hey, trust me this year and stick with the program, and I think we can make it work. And we kept it to moderate to low intensity. I changed my program. I adapted a new tool, per se. I took that tool, applied it to this individual, and it worked perfectly. I mean, it was perfect for this person. Jake thrived under the lower intensity, never got injured, got faster, got stronger. And I'll give you a little tip about what we did on how we changed it. I stripped away all the speed work. I stripped away all the intensity in the running. And all we did was improved his fatigue resistance, meaning if he could run an 8-minute mile for 10 miles, I wanted him to run an 8-minute mile for 20 miles. That's all we cared about. I didn't want him to go to 7:30s for 10 miles. I wanted him to take his 8-minute pace, and I wanted him to do it for 20 minutes. I know it sounds easy. It sounds very logical. But that's, and some people argue it. They'll be like, well, if he can do a 7:30 for 10, then he should be able to do 8 minutes for 20. It doesn't work like that, believe it or not. It does not. Not for this athlete. I'm not saying it does not work across the board, but a lot of people think if my 5K time is 6 minutes, then my marathon time should be 3 hours or whatever that, however that mix is. And it's not always the case, because sometimes somebody can run a really, really good 5K, but their endurance is not good enough to dumb it down percentage-wise to like a longer event. Like, take a percentage of that 5K time and run it out. Now, does that work for some people? Sure, it does. Definitely does. But in my experience, it doesn't work for a majority of the people. So I think that what we did with him is we said, hey, we're building fatigue resistance. I want you to hold paces for longer periods of time, and we want to work on drills. We want to work on staying healthy. We want to work on, this is key right here, we want to work on knowing when we wake up, if we don't feel good, skip the workout or dumb it down. Because a lot of times we want to force ourselves to do workouts we shouldn't do because we're in type A, and this is a type A type of sport in endurance athletes for triathlon. So anyway, he did all that. We dialed it all in. He showed up on race day and he completed his Ironman and he killed it. He had a crazy, I think he averaged 20 miles an hour on the bike. He did 12:30 pace, which is not lightning fast for you pros out there, but for this amateur, it was phenomenal. He did like 11:30, which is outstanding for this gentleman. I mean, this is a person who I would have estimated 14 or 15 minute pace, 13 minute maybe, and he destroyed it, knocked it out of the ballpark because we found the program that worked for him. Now, it took a couple years to do that, but we found it. And now we're just going to refine that program, and he's going to, and what was really great is after the event, he wanted to start training again, and he liked the sport, and he wanted to continue. So many times, the lady that I was speaking with today, so many times, when they're done, they're done. They want 2 weeks off. They want 3 weeks off. They want a month off. They want to be able to do all these different things. And I'm like, that's odd because you're training to do something you should be loving to do because you're doing it on your free time, that you think about all the time, that you should be motivated. But when you're done with the event, you're like done. Oh, thank God that's over. Like, that's how I feel when I go to the fucking dentist. Like, I go to the dentist, and when it's over, I'm like, thank God that's over. I don't want to go again. I mean, I understand Ironman's painful and all, but you should enjoy it to a point where you're like, hey, I can't wait to do the next one, or I want to do the next one, and I want to get back into training because training's my lifestyle, and that's what I want to do. So I think if you come out of that and you feel burnt out, you feel like I need a month off, or you feel like that's it, one, is you either doing it for the wrong reasons, it's probably not for you, or you did it wrong, right? You did it wrong. So for this particular athlete, I think that he nailed it, and that was Jake. So in summary, I was talking about different, training methods: high mileage, low mileage, the right miles. I like the right miles. Coaches who have been around a little bit longer have more tools. Like when I first started, I had one tool. Now I have 20 tools, so I can adjust and craft that. Endurance training takes about 3 years, 4 years to become a really good endurance athlete, especially in the triathlon world. And then it's a team approach. There's a lot of people involved in making the work. I mean, if you don't have, maybe sometimes you need a nutritionist or a bike fitter or an overall arching coach, like a head coach of a football team. Some people need that. And then make it fun, make it enjoyable, and decide where you want to be with it. Do you want to try to win events, which means you're going to have to push those edges? Or is it something you're like, hey, I just want to travel, do well, be healthy, and stay in the sport for a long time? All right, guys, that's all I have for you. Next podcast, we'll be back with kind of developing the wind tunnel, what I learned in the wind tunnel, and working at a pro camp. Give you a little insider on working at pro camps and what goes on. That's all I have for you today. As always, thanks for tuning in to Aeropro Coaching, and up your watts.